12-year-old girl was tortured and unalived for 4 of the people responsible are out of prison.
The way the boat flipped, an air bubble formed, and he was actually given a small space to breathe in right there on the.
So I've researched quite a few cases so far, and I have to say this one is probably one of the most infuriating cases I think I've ever covered. A 12-year-old girl was tortured and unalived for seemingly no reason at all, and all 4 of the people responsible are out of prison. So before we start, take a good look at these pictures, because any 4 of these women could be living in your town. This is the case of 12-year-old Shonda Scherer. This begins in 1990 when 17-year-old Melinda Lovelace was dating 15-year-old Amanda Heavrin. Now, they had been dating for some time, but then Amanda allegedly started to lose interest in Melinda and they kind of started to separate. Amanda and Shanda both attended the same school, Hazelwood Junior High. And one day, Amanda met Shanda, they became friends, and then shortly after, they started exchanging love letters. For a short time, Amanda and Shanda both had a romantic relationship, and this made Melinda extremely jealous. Melinda began to see Amanda and Shanda at events together, and this made her extremely upset, and she wanted to, at this point, unalive Shanda. She was very publicly telling people that she wanted to unalive Shanda, and she even wrote a letter to Amanda saying this. Pause to read. At the time, Shanda's mother was pretty concerned of her daughter's relationship with Amanda, so she eventually moved schools and moved her to a Catholic school. Now, Shanda also believed that this would be best for them to split up, so she also split up with Amanda. So how does this weird love triangle turn into such a brutal unaliving? Well, let's talk about exactly what happened on that night. On the night of January 10th, 1992, 4 women, 16-year-old Melinda Lovelace, 17-year-old Lori Tackett, 15-year-old Toni Lawrence, and 15-year-old Hope Rippey. All 4 of the women drove to Melinda's house in New Albany, Indiana. Now, Melinda had let the girls know that she was upset with Shanda because she allegedly stole her girlfriend, so she proceeded to show all of the girls a knife and said that she wanted to scare Shanda with this. Hope Rippey drove all 4 girls over to Shanda's father's house in Jefferson, Indiana. Now, Melinda and Shanda had already met and she was obviously threatening her, so she knew she couldn't go up to the door. But Shanda had never met the other 3 women, so Melinda used this to her advantage by telling 2 of the girls to go up to the door and lure her into the car. She told the girls to tell Shanda that they were Amanda's friends, and Amanda wanted to talk to her just one last time, so go up to the door and get her to come out to the car and talk with Amanda. Now, when they did this, Shanda said she couldn't leave just then because her parents were still awake, so she asked them to come back at midnight. Now, although this really upset Melinda at first, the other girls tried to calm her down by saying, "Don't worry, we're going to come back at midnight. We will come back and get her." So that's exactly what they did. Running out of time, but continue to part 2. This is part 2 of the case of 12-year-old Shonda Scherer. Again, the girls were asked to come back after midnight, so they had to figure out what to do for a few hours. They decided to drive down to Louisville, Kentucky, where they went to Audubon Skate Park and attended a punk rock show. They stayed here for a few hours until it was finally midnight and they headed back to Shanda's house. They arrived back at the house around 12:30 a.m., and while 2 girls went up to the door to go get Shanda, Melinda hid in the back seat holding the knife. And again, she did this because she knew Shanda would recognize her and wouldn't come any closer. Now, Shanda got in the car thinking all 3 girls were Amanda's friends and that she was going to see Amanda. Lori started asking her questions about her relationship with Amanda, and again, Shanda thought that these were all friends, so she just willingly started telling them about her relationship with Amanda. And as she's talking about it, Melinda gets up from the back seat and holds a knife to Shanda's neck. She starts threatening her and taunting her and asking her to tell her more about her relationship with Amanda as she's holding a knife to her neck. Now, Shanda begged and pleaded to go home. She said she would never talk to Amanda again. She wants nothing to do with Amanda, but this wasn't good enough. The girls then pulled up to an abandoned building called the Witch's Castle. They dragged Shanda inside where they bound her legs and arms together. After they had her bound up, Melinda started severely taunting Shanda and saying that she was going to cut her hair off with a knife. She started taking her jewelry off and passing it to the girls so they could all wear it and just taunt her with it. Shanda even was wearing a little Mickey Mouse watch, and Melinda took it off and started playing the music, and they all started dancing to the music that was playing. Then one of the girls went back to the car, grabbed a shirt, and came back and lit it on fire. And at this moment, they started to worry that cars passing by might see the fire or the smoke, so they quickly gathered Shonda, put her back in the car, and headed to another area. And I'd like to preface this next part by stating both Hope and Tony claimed that around this time is when they started to get very scared, and allegedly they were terrified of Melinda, and they just kept going along with it because they were worried Melinda was going to hurt them. I think that's a bunch of bull, and I'm going to explain why. After they left Witch's Castle, they began to look for another area to take Shonda, and they got lost several times, and 2 different times they stopped at gas stations to look for directions. Both times that they stopped at gas stations, they were all free to go wherever. One of the girls went and made a phone call, Melinda was in the store getting stuff. They were all free to do whatever they wanted. At no point during either of these stops did the 2 terrified girls get out, run away, call the police. Tony did make a point to call somebody during the gas station stop, but it wasn't the police. It was one of her friends. You know, she was having anxiety and she needed somebody to calm her down. Running out of time again, but continue to part 3. This is part 3 of the Shonda Scherer case, and I'm sorry this one's a little bit longer. I just wanted to make sure all important details are covered, and there's a lot of details. So after 2 different stops at gas stations and Shonda begging and crying to go home the entire ride, Lori eventually took them over to an abandoned house. This was apparently off of a logging road, and it was in a heavily forested area, so they weren't worried about any noises that would be made here. Melinda and Lori both grabbed Shonda out of the car and forced her to take all of her clothes off. At this moment, Hope even remembers getting out of the car and thinking she was freezing, so she got back in the car and continued to watch Shonda as she was shivering, being forced to strip all of her clothes off. After having her stripped to everything except for her underwear, Melinda begins viciously beating Shonda. Melinda then tries to cut her throat, but the knife was too dull, so both Melinda and Lori took turns stabbing Shonda in the chest. Hope at this moment gets out of the car and starts to hold Shonda down. She claims that she got out of the car and was trying to pull Shonda away, but again, I don't believe that. She was holding her down. They then began to strangle her until she passed out, and at this point they believed she was most likely unalived. So they threw her in the trunk, and they all 4 proceeded to head to Lori's house so they could get cleaned up. The girls all arrive at Lori's house, start cleaning up, they start chit-chatting, drinking soda, and then suddenly they hear screaming coming from outside. It was Shonda screaming from the trunk. Lori says, "Don't worry girls, I'll take care of it," and she heads out to the car, opens the trunk, and stabs Shonda several more times. She then goes back in the house and cleans up again because now she's all messy again. The girls then continue to just hang out, chit-chat, play some games, all while Shonda's still sitting in the trunk. Around 2:30 a.m., Melinda and Lori both decide, hey, let's go for a joyride around town. Hope and Tony didn't want to go on this joyride, so it was just Melinda and Lori and Shonda in the trunk. During their car ride, they had to stop several times because Shonda was still making noises from the trunk. Each time they would pull over, Lori would open the trunk and proceed to beat Shonda with a tire iron until she stopped making noises. There was also reports that Lori SA'd Shonda with the tire iron. After a little bit of time, Melinda and Lori head back to the house, where they continued to tell the 2 girls the story of what they just did. The girls were laughing so loud that they woke up Lori's mom, so Lori's mom came down, told them they had to leave. But obviously they had something else they needed to take care of first. Continue to the next part where I talk about the final moments of Shonda's life. This is part 4 of the Shonda Scherer case. Now, before the girls could go home, they obviously had to take care of Shonda. They first stopped at a gas station, bought a Pepsi, poured out the Pepsi, and filled up the Pepsi bottle with gas. They then drove north until they found a big field with a gravel road next to it. Hope, Lori, and Melinda proceeded to wrap up still living Shonda in a blanket, drag her out of the car, and drag her over into a field. Hope then proceeded to pour gasoline all over Shonda, and then Lori set her on fire.
Her body was drawn up in what's called the pugilistic posture, which is typical of persons that die in fire. They draw up like a boxer. Based on the investigation, after they got Shanda's out of the trunk and laid her down here, Hope Riffy poured the gas, and Lori Tackett set her on fire. They then went up this road, turned around, and came back and saw that the body was still visible. So there was still a little gas left. And Melinda poured the rest of it on Shanda and set her on fire again, and Shanda was still alive at that point.
After setting her on fire twice, they were finally convinced that she was unalived, so they proceeded to take Hope and Tony home, and Lori and Melinda went back to Lori's house. Later on that day, Melinda and Lori both met up with Amanda and told Amanda what happened. Amanda didn't believe them at first, but then they proceeded to show her the trunk full of Shanda's blood, so Amanda got a little worried and asked to be taken home. Although Amanda seems kind of like an innocent person in this case, she's really not. Even after seeing the bloody trunk, Amanda did nothing. She didn't even go to the police, she didn't tell anybody. Not to mention, Melinda told her several times that she wanted to unalive Shanda. Again, going back to this letter she wrote Melinda, I want Shanda unalived. She also did an interview with Dr. Phil that I think was absolutely disgusting, and I'm going to play a clip right now, but I highly suggest you guys watch the whole thing. The audacity! Amanda, I'm so sorry about your basketball scholarships. I mean, really. You know, Shanda's parents lost their child, their 12-year-old child, for no reason at all, but your basketball scholarships, I mean, I can't believe you suffered such a loss. Continue to the next part where I talk about what happens next. This is part 5 of the Shanda Shara case. On the morning of January 11th, 1992, 2 men reported seeing a severely burned body on the side of the road. Now, the body was so burnt that it was unrecognizable, but at the same time, Shanda's parents also noticed she was missing, so they filed a police report. Around 8:20 p.m. on that same day, both Hope and Tony went into the police station where they confessed to the crime and implicated both Melinda and Lori. All 4 of the girls were minors at the time, but they were all tried as adults, and all 4 of them accepted a plea deal in order to avoid capital punishment. So now I'm going to talk about why this case is so infuriating. Let's talk about each of the sentences they were given versus what they actually served. Toni Lawrence was considered to be pretty cooperative, so she was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. She served only 9 years and was released in December of 2000. Hope Rippey was originally sentenced to 60 years, but on appeal, a judge granted that to be cut in half to 35 years. She served 14 years and was released in April of 2006. Lori was sentenced to 60 years in prison. She was released after 26 years in 2018. And the most shocking of all, the ringleader, Melinda Loveless, she was also sentenced to 6 years in prison. She served 27 years and was released in September of 2019. These are the most recent pictures of the 4 women, so take a good look at what they look like. I've seen several articles of people defending these ladies and talking about how Melinda had a horrible childhood, but in my opinion, that is irrelevant. That does not matter. There is nothing that could have happened to Melinda when she was younger that gives her a reason to do this to Shanda. So I am not going to entertain anything that happened in their past lives in this video because it doesn't matter. All 4 of these women should still be in prison. At the very least, Lori and Melinda should absolutely be in prison. It truly doesn't make sense to me how they go from pleading guilty so they can avoid capital punishment to being released after 26 years. All 4 of these women are out amongst us living their lives while Shanda didn't get to live hers. In my opinion, Shanda did not get justice in this case. There is no reason these women should be out of prison. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to play a clip from the Dr. Phil show where Shanda's parents got to confront Hope, and I think it's just amazing.
I'm going to talk about the man who survived almost 3 days at the bottom of the sea. His name was Mr. Harrison O'Keefe, and he was from Nigeria. And in 2013, with a lot of luck and intelligence, he managed to survive a shipwreck on board of a tugboat at the bottom of the ocean for almost 3 days. For those of you that don't know what a tugboat is, this is a tugboat. You see them all the time, and they're used to push, pull, or tow other larger vessels. So this is Harrison O'Keefe, right here in the middle. At about 4:50 a.m., the tugboat that he was on started to capsize while he was in the bathroom. Now, could you imagine you're in the bathroom? I mean, and all of a sudden you're on a ship, and the ship starts to go down. He actually had a window in the bathroom, and he actually saw 3 of his friends being dragged out to sea. Then with every passing minute, more and more water started to fill into the bathroom. But unfortunately, the door was jammed, so he couldn't get out. Being stuck inside, the only thing he could do was hope for a miracle. And he got one. Well, by some miracle, the way the boat flipped, an air bubble formed, and he was actually given a small space to breathe in right there on the boat. Unfortunately, the rest of the boat was flooded, but this gave him a slim chance at survival. He had to remove all of his clothing because they were weighing him down and he couldn't swim to reach the air pocket each time. So down there in total, complete darkness, having to be naked, cold water, all sorts of thoughts going on in your head, not knowing what time it is, how long it's been down there, and being submerged halfway into salt water, it was a recipe for disaster. Now, as humans, we're not supposed to be in salt water for that long. It's not good for us, and our skin will start peeling off. Not to mention the fact that just being in water in general wrinkles up your body, and you get dehydrated. And now here he is down there for hours and hours, dying of hunger, thirst, and at the bottom of the ocean, pitch black and cold. Not knowing he's going to last much longer, he knew he had to get a way out. So he tries to break down the bathroom door, not knowing what could happen. So with all his strength, he breaks down the bathroom door. Fortunately, nothing really changed, but now he had to figure out where he was going to go. It's total darkness. He has to plan his next route. If he makes the wrong choice, he ends up in a place where there's no air, and his story ends. But he was running out of oxygen in the room that he was in, so he had to go somewhere. Fortunately, he chose right and ended up inside the interior cabin of another part of the boat that had a lot more air and a lot more space for him to move around without as much of his body being submerged. From there, he decided to stay and plan his next move. But that's when he began to feel fear. Inside that room, he could hear noises of chewing sounds and some rotting smells. It was at this moment he realized that was the sound of other fish feeding off his friends, and he was likely next. So now he's been down there for 48 hours, cold, starving, dehydrated, running lower and lower on air, and even lower on hope, when he started to hear a larger noise. At first he thought it was a rescue crew. Then a larger fish coming to eat him. Or even it was a hallucination. Hallucination or not, he decides, I've got to make some noise. He starts screaming, help, help, save me, banging on anything he could, trying to make some sort of noise just to get noticed by whatever that is that he was hearing. And then out of nowhere, a diver appears. And then a second diver, and a third diver. Here's a picture of him from down there in the wreckage. The team was surprised to see him even still alive. So they equipped some diving equipment on him, gave him some water to hydrate him, and gave him a helmet with an oxygen mask on it so he could breathe and they could bring him back to shore. When he was rescued, because it had been pitch black and he had no time reference, he had no clue how long he'd been down there. His thought was several hours, but he was 90 feet below the surface, and they let him know he'd been down there for 60 hours. He was shocked and unfortunately suffered a lot of trauma from the situation, stating he still wakes up with nightmares of sinking and credits it all to a divine miracle. It's a good thing the divers arrived because they said there was very little oxygen left in that part of the cabin. So thank goodness for miracles. Like and subscribe for more stuff like this.